In the summer of 1999, a Toronto teenager leaves her house for what she believes is a new job. She had been eager to earn some money over the summer heading into high school. That afternoon, she would never come home. It would take months of searching before her family would get answers as to what happened to her. But that would still not lead them to the who. As police piece together evidence, they begin to think that a phony job offer may have lured her to her death. And that job offer leads back to a strong suspect. Despite this, nobody has ever been charged in her death. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time meant a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Sharmini Anandavel. I want to thank you all so much for tuning into another week of the podcast. When I run reports of my listener base, I'm always honored to see the different countries who listen to my podcast all over the world. For a while, I have gotten requests to cover cases outside of the US, and today I'm doing just that for the first time. Ironically, Toronto is closer to me than most of my listener base in the US because, geographically speaking, if I crossed Lake Ontario, that's pretty much where I'd land. The case I'm about to tell you about today really struck a chord with people locally in Toronto and eventually across Canada and the world. And it's easy to understand why. The young teenager at the center of this case was getting ready to start high school, and like so many kids her age, she wanted to earn some of her own money and gain a little independence. Her parents were navigating that familiar push and pull, wanting to give their daughter room to grow and experience some independence, while also knowing that she was still young, still vulnerable, and still learning how to navigate the world through lived experience. And the horrific crime exposes every parent's worst nightmare in this scenario. I'll be transparent with you that going into this case, there is a strong suspect, and you'll likely be frustrated as you listen. Before I start the episode, I just want to give credit to the CBC investigative podcast Uncover with host Michelle Shepard and the Toronto Star for in-depth reporting on this case, and it helped me bring it to you. I couldn't possibly get to the level of detail that Michelle did for her long-form look into this case, and she was able to sit down with family, friends, community members, law enforcement, and even the prime suspect himself. Michelle reported on the case in real time as a young crime reporter when it happened, and then she revisited it for the deep dive all those years later. But it has been several years since that came out, so I wanted to share this story with you today again, to give it another boost. And with that, let's get into it. Sharmini Anandavel was in a place where she was really enjoying life. At 15 years old in 1999, Sharmini had been in the Toronto area for 5 years. For the first 10 years of her life, Sharmini grew up in Sri Lanka. In 1994, her father moved to Toronto to build a new life for the family. He landed a job, and a short time later, Sharmini, her mother, and 2 brothers were all able to join him. And I do want to share the backdrop of what was happening in Sharmini's home country at the time that prompted the move to Canada. When the Anandavel family moved to Canada in 1994, they were leaving Sri Lanka at a time when the country had already been engulfed in civil war for more than a decade. The conflict, which began in 1983, was largely between the Sri Lankan government and the Tamil Tigers, who were fighting for an independent Tamil state in northern and eastern parts of the country. By the mid-1990s, years of fighting had taken a devastating toll. Tens of thousands of people had been killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. And Tamil civilians in particular were living amid military checkpoints, arrests, disappearances, and ongoing violence. Many Tamil families left Sri Lanka during these years, and Canada became home to a growing Sri Lankan Tamil community, with a large number settling in and around Toronto. By June of 1999, Sharmini was in grade 9. She was a student at Woodbine Junior High, and she was just weeks away from graduating and heading into high school. She was described by people who knew her as bright, outgoing, opinionated, and incredibly kind. One of her teachers talked about how that she was a peacekeeper and the type of kid who would notice a student off by themselves and would just ask them to join. She was proud of her heritage. She had taken extensive dance classes, and she also was a serious academic. She hoped to become a lawyer someday. But in the meantime, she was excited about taking another small step towards independence. She wanted to find a summer job and earn some money of her own. Sharmini had watched as her family worked hard to get established in Toronto, and she and her brothers actually used to deliver newspapers early in the morning with their father, so she had a strong work ethic at her core. Sharmini and her family lived in the Don Valley Village area of North York, in a part of the neighborhood locals commonly called the Peanut. The nickname comes from the unusual design of Don Mills Road between Shepherd and Finch, where the northbound and southbound lanes split apart and curve around a large peanut-shaped piece of land. Inside that loop were many of the things families in the neighborhood used every day: schools, a community center and arena, a church, park space, and Peanut Plaza. Surrounding it were rows of high-rise apartment towers and some townhouse complexes. In the late 1990s, the Peanut was a diverse, working-class community and home to many immigrant and newcomer families, making Sharmini's family far from unusual in the neighborhood. Sharmini lived with her parents and two younger brothers in one of those high-rise apartment buildings on Don Mills Road. With so many families living under one roof, there was a sense of familiarity among the people who lived there, particularly among the kids who regularly crossed paths in the building and around the neighborhood. Sharmini's school, known as Woodbine Middle School, was right within the Peanut, meaning most of her daily life was really concentrated in this relatively small area. On Saturday, June 12th, 1999, that was the day Sharmini was supposed to start her new job. It was already shaping up to be an uncomfortable day in Toronto. The summer of 99 would go on to be one of the hottest the city had ever experienced in decades. And that morning, Toronto was already covered in heavy humidity. The Anandavels didn't have air conditioning in their apartment, so there wasn't much relief from the heat inside either. Sharmini had told her parents that she had gotten a job answering phones at a place just a few blocks from their apartment. Her parents had actually planned on driving her to work that morning, but their plans changed unexpectedly when they were called away to help a sick relative. Before they left, they asked Sharmini to make sure she wrote down the name, address, and phone number of her employer and left it for them. Since this was a brand new job and they weren't going to be able to take her there themselves, they wanted to know exactly where she would be going and how they could reach her. At around 9 that morning, Sharmini was ready to head out. After work that afternoon, Sharmini planned to make a stop at Fairview Mall. She had a pair of earrings that she wanted to return, so the plan was to take care of that errand before heading home. Fairview Mall was a large shopping center in North York, located at the intersection of Don Mills Road and Shepherd Avenue East, not far from where the Anandavel family lived. In fact, it was close enough that the mall was a familiar and easily accessible place for Sharmini. Her friends would hang out there a lot. Sometimes they would leave and go have lunch one place and then head to the mall. Sharmini's younger brother walked her down the hallway to the elevator. She pressed the button, waited for the doors to open, and stepped inside. Her brother watched as the doors closed. There was just one problem. Sharmini had forgotten to leave behind the contact information her parents had asked for. But there wasn't necessarily anything about that job that raised alarm bells at that time. In fact, Sharmini had told them that she had gotten connected with the job through someone they knew, and that was a neighbor named Stanley Tippett. Stanley was 23 years old and lived with his wife and young son just one floor below the Anandavel family. He was a familiar face around the building and spent time with some kids who lived there as well, sometimes taking them to swimming or teaching them judo. He was also known to walk around the building almost like an unofficial security guard, and he had told people that he had worked as a police officer. So this wasn't someone Sharmini had just met or her parents had never heard of before. Stanley had been around, they knew who he was, and at that point, there wasn't really a reason for them to think Sharmini getting a job through him was something they needed to be concerned about. But as that Saturday went on, Sharmini didn't come home. Her family had expected her back after work in her stop at the mall. And when more and more time passed without hearing from her, they started to worry. It wasn't normal for Sharmini to be gone for that long without checking in. And they didn't know exactly where she was supposed to be working because she hadn't left that address and phone number that morning. Her parents knew that Stanley was the one who had connected her with a job, so they went down to his apartment hoping he might know where she was or how they could reach her. They were in for a huge surprise because they knocked and nobody answered. And it wasn't just that nobody was home. Nobody lived there anymore. Stanley's apartment was completely vacant. He, his wife, and their young son had moved out, and Sharmini's family had no idea this was happening. So now, Sharmini hadn't come home, they didn't have the information for the job she was supposed to be at, and the one person they knew had connected her with that job had apparently moved out of the building. At this point, Sharmini's parents knew they needed help finding her, so they called police to report her missing. They explained that their 15-year-old daughter had left that morning for her first day at a new job, was supposed to come home afterward, but they hadn't heard from her. They also shared what they knew about Stanley and the fact that when they went looking for him that evening, they discovered he and his family had moved out of the apartment. The media in Toronto, particularly the Toronto Star, immediately began reporting on her disappearance. Sharmini's missing persons flyers described her as 5'2" and 102 pounds with brown skin and straight dark hair and brown eyes. She was last seen wearing a striped shirt, black jeans, and white running shoes. As the first couple of days passed without any sign of Sharmini, her family did a press conference. Her father pleaded, saying, quote, "Sharmini, where are you? We are waiting for you. Your parents are loving you. Your mommy is crying every day. Your brother never eats. He never drinks, never sleeps. Sharmini, please, please, please come home." Police now had one person they wanted to speak with right away, Stanley Tippett. They learned that Stanley hadn't disappeared at the same time as Sharmini. But get this, he had actually moved out of the apartment building about 2 full weeks earlier and was now living roughly an hour away in Oshawa, Ontario, with his wife and young child. According to Stanley's own later account, less than 24 hours after Sharmini was reported missing, around a dozen police cruisers showed up at his Oshawa home, and he was taken back to Toronto's 33 Division for questioning. When police questioned him, Stanley denied having anything to do with Sharmini's disappearance, and he also denied ever offering her a job. What he did acknowledge was giving her a job application. His explanation was that he knew Sharmini was looking for summer work, and he, being the neighborhood go-to guy that he was, he had picked up an application for her after learning that a local swimming pool was hiring. So in his version of events, the whole thing was just an innocent gesture, and Sharmini's parents had apparently just misunderstood what kind of job he had been helping her to find and his role in helping her find it. Meanwhile, while police were trying to figure out where Sharmini could have gone, they also began looking through her bedroom for anything that may give them some direction. At this point, they still had to consider all the possibilities that came with a missing teenager. Had she made plans her parents didn't know about? Was there somewhere she intended to go? Had she packed anything or left behind a note? But as they looked around, there really wasn't anything suggesting Sharmini had planned to leave. Her clothes and personal belongings were still there, and nothing about the room pointed towards a teenager who had packed up and ran away. Instead, investigators found something that seemed to connect directly back to the reason Sharmini had left home that morning in the first place: the new job. In her room was what looked at first like a real job application. It was for something called the Metro Search Unit. But the closer police looked at it, the stranger it became, because this wasn't a normal application with like a company logo or letterhead. It missed so many elements that a typical job application would have. It was typed on plain paper and asked for only a handful of basic details, including Sharmini's name, birth date, address, and signature. There was no real description of the position, no questions about previous employment, no references, nothing explaining exactly what the Metro Search Unit even was. Neither police nor Sharmini's family recognized the name. I mean, investigators knew there was nothing called that within their department, and they would ultimately determine that there was no legitimate Metro Search Unit behind the application. Whatever this piece of paper was, it wasn't an application for the swimming pool job that Stanley had told police about. So between it looking fake and being for something that seemed outside of the local pool, which was also different than what Sharmini had told her family about the work she would be doing, nothing was adding up. But according to her friends, there was supposed to be a level of secrecy when it came to the job that she was actually going to be doing. Sharmini had apparently been told that she would actually be working undercover. She couldn't tell people exactly what she'd be doing. And that makes the application police found in her bedroom even more concerning. The name Metro Search Unit sounded official enough, especially to a 15-year-old girl who believed Stanley had connections to law enforcement. But police couldn't find any legitimate organization by that name. And the application itself gave almost no information about who Sharmini would actually be working for or what she'd be doing. That secrecy is important because if Sharmini believed this was undercover work, then being told not to share the details may not have seemed strange to her. It could explain why her parents had one understanding of the job while her friends had another. More importantly, it meant that whoever was behind this supposed job had created a reason for Sharmini not to tell adults in her life exactly where she was going, who she would be with, or what she would be doing when she got there, which is chilling to say the least. Investigators continued to speak with her inner circle and reached out to the general public to try to get a sense of Sharmini's movements that day. There were a couple of different reported sightings of Sharmini that day. One witness said they believed they saw Sharmini sitting on a bench at Fairview Mall at around 10:30 that morning. And that seemed credible because it was a friend of Sharmini's who said that, not just a random stranger who had seen her face on the news. Another person said they thought they saw her at Peanut Plaza, which is a bit north of the mall, and that was at 11:45, and that she was alone at that point. There are mixed opinions on if Sharmini ever made it to the mall or the order she conducted her errands that day, in part because the store employees at the place she'd be returning her jewelry said there was no such return that day. All the sightings are still noted in police files, but could never be completely confirmed. So her last confirmed sighting remains her leaving the apartment building a little after 9 a.m., somewhere between 9 and 9:30 that Saturday morning. Detective Bob Peddle of Toronto's 33 Division told the media at the time, quote, "We're not looking at this as a simple runaway. This disappearance is completely out of character." Sharmini's parents were tormented with the lack of answers, particularly because not only was she trying to earn some money for typical teenage things and also some accessories for her graduation from middle school, in particular, shoes to match her mauve dress she was going to wear, she also wanted to help out with the family's expenses. She had told her mother, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll look after you. I'm going to earn some money and help you." And I just can't imagine how that must have just eaten away at her mother. At the approach of the 1 week mark, without any signs of Sharmini, friends and family held a candlelight vigil. Friends told the media that everyone at school was so distraught and that they missed their friend who loved to listen to reggae and R&B and bake delicious snacks. Police really were pulling out all the stops to find her. Within days of Sharmini disappearing, the search had grown into what investigators described as a level 3 search, the most intensive search they could conduct. On one day alone, around 30 officers spent hours combing fields and parks near Woodbine Junior High School, where Sharmini was a student. Officers on foot walked alongside all-terrain vehicles while a specially trained team used grid search techniques to methodically work through the brush and greenbelt areas around Bayview and Finch, eventually expanding the search down towards Don Mills Road and Lawrence Avenue. Detective Riddle, the lead investigator, said officers were essentially pulling out every stop they could think of. Many of them were working 18-hour days. They were following up on tips, reported sightings, and they were going back out day after day, not knowing what they'd find. They were also hoping that surveillance footage from the plaza might help them figure out what happened after the reported sightings of Sharmini that morning. If she had been there, the tape could potentially confirm the sighting. It could show what direction she went and where she left, or even more importantly, whether she met up with someone. Investigators obtained the videotape and they painstakingly went through it, hoping Sharmini would appear somewhere on the footage. But in the end, it gave them nothing. Sharmini could not be identified anywhere on the tape. Amidst all of this, police were becoming increasingly concerned that the job Sharmini believed she was going to that morning had simply been a ruse to get her to leave the house, which continuously brought them back to Stanley Tippit. Something about his story just didn't sit right. Now, whenever I've seen commentary on this case, I've heard people say things like, how could a community just trust this guy? How was he giving kids swim lessons and acting like this unofficial mayor of the apartment building? And how are people just trusting him? And I get it, but a few things to consider. Number one, this was 1999. The internet was in its infancy. There was no scenario where Sharmini was going to be finding a job on Indeed or Craigslist or one of those places. Word of mouth was common, or someone helping to hook you up with a job. Also, I was on one of the various Reddit threads for this case, and there was actually a commenter who said they were an immigrant to Canada around the same time and lived not far from Sharmini's neighborhood. And they basically said that to all the skeptical people to consider that the entire area was full of immigrants who had just come from a lot of countries that were in great political turmoil. So they were just happy to be in Canada and feel safer at that point. This commenter also said that their neighborhoods had a huge sense of community and that the commenter's family would leave them in the care of neighbors from time to time. I saw a few other comments that amplified this sentiment, so I did just want to mention that. A quick look into Stanley Tippit in 1999 would show a pattern of concerning behavior. One of the first things police were able to clear up was Stanley's supposed connection to law enforcement. People in the apartment building knew him as someone who either worked for the police or had some type of connection to them. And based on what Sharmini had told her friends about this undercover job, it appears she believed that too. But when investigators actually checked, they learned that Stanley Tippit was not a police officer and had never been. Whatever impression he had given Sharmini and the other people around him, there was no legitimate police job behind it. And this was not the first time Stanley had led people in the building to believe he was connected to law enforcement. While living in the building, he had once told a group of boys that he was a police officer and needed to borrow one of their bicycles for an investigation. He also was known to walk around the building wearing a police jacket, which Stanley would later say he bought at a flea market. Some of the children in the building genuinely believed he had been a police officer, including Sharmini's younger brother. And investigators looking further into Stanley's past had reason for concern beyond the police impersonation. In 1992, when Stanley was still a minor, he followed a teenage girl after she got off a bus. He ordered her to lie down, and he held a pellet gun to her head. The girl later said she believed she was going to be sexually assaulted. Just as a side note, that bit of information about his assault as a minor didn't come out until years later. But I did want to mention it because it does paint the picture of just the type of person Stanley Tippit was. In July of 1999, Stanley Tippit did an interview with the Toronto Star where he said his life had been turned upside down. He said that at that time, in the past couple of weeks, police had interrogated him 3 times, searched his apartment and his car, interviewed his family, friends, and employers, and put him under 24-hour surveillance and tailed him everywhere. Ultimately, at that time, there was nothing concrete that could connect Stanley Tippit to Sharmini's disappearance, and he did have a story of where he was that day. According to Michelle Shepard's reporting, Stanley's own account actually placed him back in Sharmini's neighborhood. Although he and his family had moved to Oshawa a couple of weeks earlier, Stanley still had work to do in the Don Mills area, and he returned that Saturday for a job cutting grass. At around the same time Sharmini was leaving her apartment at 9 a.m., Stanley was driving past her building on his way to that job. In detail, Stanley said that morning he left his new apartment in Oshawa, stopped briefly at a store in Scarborough, and then dropped his wife and 2-year-old son at his in-laws' apartment back in the Don Mills neighborhood. He then went back by his old apartment building, where he said he may have slowed down and took a look at it, but never stopped and got out of his car. He said he got to his first lawn mowing job at 9:30. He then had car troubles throughout the day and stopped into Fairview Mall to wash his greasy hands. He said that he was at the mall around 10:30 a.m. Coincidentally, you may remember this is when Sharmini was spotted at the mall. He then said he spent the rest of the afternoon doing lawn mowing jobs and that he had receipts and employer accounts to match it. He would later tell Michelle Shepard at that time the last time he had actually seen Sharmini was about a week before he moved out of the building, and he denied having any contact with her on the day she disappeared. The search for Sharmini stretched into weeks and then months. Her classmates graduated middle school without her and honored her in the ceremony she had been so looking forward to. Detectives had to combat rumors such as things like that she'd been kidnapped for an arranged marriage. Her parents were quick to say that had they still lived in Sri Lanka, the arranged marriage would be a strong possibility, but that here there was none and there would be none. And then in October, all speculation as to where Sharmini was would end. And it was the nightmare everyone had been hoping wouldn't be true. For nearly 4 months, Sharmini's family was left without an answer about where she was. That changed on Saturday, October 9th, 1999, when a father and son were hiking through the East Don Parkland along the Don River. As they made their way through the trails and wooded area, they came across something unmistakable, a human skull. Police were called and quickly descended on the area, and the location was only a little ways away from Sharmini's apartment building. Investigators found what appeared to have been a shallow grave with a log placed over it. But there was very little left for them to recover. Along with the skull, searchers found a mandible and several bone fragments. A forensic archaeologist was brought in to help carefully excavate the area, but investigators also found a coyote den nearby. Between the animals and the unusually hot summer Toronto had experienced that year, the remains had been badly affected. Michelle Shepard later reported that coyotes had ravaged what was left, leaving police with little usable forensic evidence. At first, police didn't know whose remains they had found. For Sharmini's family, though, there was an obvious fear that after 4 months of searching, this could be her. 3 days later, on October 12th, dental records confirmed it. The remains belonged to Sharmini. She had been missing for exactly 4 months. And even with that confirmation, there was still very little the remains could tell investigators about what had happened to her. The condition of the remains meant they could not determine a cause of death, and there was not enough left to establish whether Sharmini had been sexually assaulted. Police also couldn't determine from the scene whether she had been killed there or whether her body had been brought there afterward. What had begun 4 months earlier as a search for a missing 15-year-old was now officially a homicide investigation. With Sharmini's remains identified, her case was now in the hands of Toronto homicide detectives Matt Crone and Greg McLean. With so little to go on, Crone and McLean went back through the investigation from the beginning, looking again at the people around Sharmini and everything that had happened in the days leading up to June 12th. And their attention continued to come back to Stanley Tippett. Police questioned him multiple times, searched his apartment, and they'd been following him as they investigated Sharmini's disappearance. They had also moved quickly when they learned that shortly after his initial questioning, Stanley had sold his car to a junkyard. Police were able to get that vehicle before it was crushed, and they seized it so they could search it for anything that might connect to Sharmini in the car. But the search didn't give them what they were hoping for. There was no blood, no hair, no other physical evidence reported that could place Sharmini inside Stanley's vehicle. There was, however, one thing missing from the car. The liner of the trunk had been removed, and police were never able to find it. You know, as one does. There was no way to establish why it was gone or what had happened to it, so as suspicious as it may have appeared, it wasn't evidence that could tie Stanley to Sharmini's murder. Detective Matt Crone became convinced that Sharmini had been killed by someone she knew, and over the course of the investigation, he became convinced that that person was Stanley Tippit. There was the supposed job, the fake Metro Search Unit application, Stanley's history of pretending to be connected to law enforcement, and the fact that his own account placed him driving past Sharmini's building at around the time she left that morning. But it was all circumstantial. There was nothing physical placing Sharmini with Stanley that day, nothing connecting him to the place where her remains were found, and no witness who could definitively say they had seen the two of them together. Crone continued trying to build a case. He questioned Stanley more than once, but Stanley continued to deny having anything to do with Sharmini's disappearance or death. Crone later remembered that interviewing him could be difficult. Sometimes Stanley would simply walk out. Other times, he would remove his hearing aids, turn away from the person questioning him, and refuse to engage. And just a quick note on that here, one thing to know about Stanley was that he has Treacher-Collins syndrome, a rare genetic condition that affects the development of the bones and tissues of the face. In Stanley's case, it gave him a very distinctive appearance, including downward slanting eyes, a receding chin, and unusually small ears, and he wore hearing aids from a young age. His mother later said that Stanley was bullied pretty severely as a child because of the way he looked. Eventually, Detective Crone took what they had to prosecutors anyway. But there still was not enough evidence to lay a charge, so the investigation reached a frustrating point. And over the next several years, police would have more reasons to take another look at him because Stanley Tippit would come to the attention of law enforcement again, this time for crimes and behavior that would reveal much more about the man investigators had been looking at since Sharmini disappeared. For several years after Sharmini's murder, Stanley remained out of trouble, at least as far as any criminal charges were concerned. By 2004, he was 28 years old, living with his wife and children in a townhouse in Collingwood. But that September, a woman who lived nearby, a young single mother with a 6-year-old son, began having problems with him. Stanley would sit in his van watching her and look through her windows. He repeatedly offered her rides. He also contacted the Children's Aid Society and made allegations that she wasn't capable of caring for her son. Another neighbor, a man named Murray, became concerned enough that he warned the woman not to go anywhere with Stanley. Murray would later tell reporter Michelle Shepard that he didn't know anything about Sharmini or the investigation into her murder at the time. He just didn't like the way Stanley behaved around women. Murray had a 10-year-old daughter himself, and Stanley had offered to drive her to dance class, but Murray refused. Eventually, the woman Stanley had been watching went to police, and Stanley was charged with criminal harassment. He pleaded guilty and apologized in court for upsetting her. The following year, Stanley and his family moved to Peterborough. And this was where we see the first documented incident that has some very obvious similarities to what Sharmini's friends had described years earlier. In October of 2005, Stanley was at a Walmart job fair when he met a 21-year-old woman who had recently immigrated to Canada. She was looking for work and told him she was trying to earn enough money to sponsor her husband, who was still living in the Netherlands. Stanley introduced himself to her as Jason Armstrong and told her he could get her a job at the YMCA. Over the next 8 days, Stanley stayed in contact with her. He showed up to her home with a birthday card, and on another occasion, he encountered her at a Taco Bell where she was filling out another job application. According to the woman's later testimony, Stanley became angry that she was still applying for jobs after he had already offered her one. And then he gave her an application for this supposed YMCA job. The application was fake. Stanley told the woman that the job would involve working with police and fire departments when people went missing. But unlike Sharmini, this woman became suspicious enough to check the story for herself. She called the YMCA to ask whether they were actually hiring and whether a man named Jason worked there. And surprise, surprise, he did not. The YMCA contacted police and Stanley was arrested. It only got worse. When police searched Stanley's van after his arrest, they found a concealed knife, a hammer, rope, plastic sheeting, and restraints. A pellet gun was also found in his basement. Stanley was charged with attempted kidnapping and criminal harassment. In December 2005, he pleaded guilty to criminal harassment, and the attempted kidnapping charge was dropped. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. Stanley was released, but police continued monitoring him while he was on probation. And then on August 6, 2008, he came into contact with 2 young girls while driving home late at night. The girls had come home from a birthday party, and the young teens had been drinking. And apparently, one of them, who was just 12 years old, was lying in the road. Stanley stopped his van and offered them a ride. Both girls got in. He eventually dropped one of them off to a nearby park, and she made it home. The 12-year-old did not. Her family reported her missing. At around 2 a.m, a nearby resident heard screaming coming from the woods near a high school. A girl could be heard begging for someone to stop. Police were called, and when an officer arrived, he saw a man emerge from the wooded area and get into a red van. The officer pursued the van through residential streets, but the chase eventually had to be called off because it had become too dangerous. Rest assured, though, a police officer had gotten the plates off the van and a good description of the driver. Police then found the 12-year-old coming out of the woods. She was crying and disoriented, her shirt was torn, and she was naked from the waist down. After tracing the plates, police quickly began looking at Stanley. But before they even reached him, Stanley called Detective Sergeant Dan Smith, the Peterborough officer responsible for monitoring him on probation, and he had a story for him. Stanley claimed that after dropping off the first girl, he had been held at gunpoint by other men and that his van had been stolen. Police did not believe him, and within about half an hour, Stanley was under arrest. At his trial in 2009, Stanley continued to deny that he had assaulted the girl. He admitted picking the 2 girls up, but claimed again that 2 men had carjacked him, thrown him from his vehicle, and then used his van to commit the assault. The judge ultimately rejected that account, and Stanley was convicted of sexually assaulting the girl. That conviction led prosecutors to take a much broader look at Stanley's history. The Crown applied to have him declared as a dangerous offender, a designation in Canada reserved for offenders considered to pose an ongoing risk of serious violent or sexual harm. And during those proceedings, incidents from much earlier in Stanley's life were brought forward as prosecutors tried to show that his behavior had developed over many years. That included that incident from '92 when Stanley was still a minor. That was the one where a teenage girl said Stanley followed her off the bus, ordered her onto the ground, and held a pellet gun to her head, and where she believed she was going to be sexually assaulted. The Crown also presented evidence from other people who had encountered Stanley over the years, including a grocery store cashier who eventually obtained a no trespass order because he would not leave her alone, and the principal of his children's elementary school, who also had him barred from the school property after getting concerned about his behavior around other students. In 2011, the judge agreed with the Crown and declared Stanley Tippett a dangerous offender. He was given an indefinite sentence, meaning there was no set date where he would be released. He could apply for parole, but he would have to convince the parole board that he no longer posed an unacceptable risk to the community. Stanley has continued to deny involvement in Sharmini's disappearance and murder. And so, for the most part, her family has had to settle with the idea that Stanley has not been found culpable in her murder, but is off the streets and not free to harm other people. I mentioned before that the 5th season of Uncovered podcast in 2019 was dedicated to Sharmini's case and hosted by Michelle Shepard, who looked into her case in real time and then again years later. And the podcast did bring forward new information. 2 men contacted Shepard with potential sightings they had never previously connected to the investigation. One of them, Joe Becker, said that on the morning Sharmini disappeared, he was stopped at a red light when he saw a young girl he now believes was Sharmini walking with a man he believes was Stanley Tippett. He said the image had stayed with him for 20 years, particularly because of the man's distinctive appearance. Another man came forward after seeing a photograph of Tippett published with the podcast and remembered encountering a man matching his appearance while jogging near the area where Sharmini's remains would later be found. Neither account could be independently confirmed, especially after that much time had passed, but CBC brought in retired homicide detective Matt Crone to formally interview Becker and preserve his statement, and Toronto police confirmed that they were reviewing the new information to determine whether it could have any impact on the case. And this is also a good example of why podcasts and other long-form coverage can be such a valuable tool in older cases. You never know who might be listening and suddenly recognize a detail or have a memory from years ago that they never realized could be important. Sometimes just hearing the entire story laid out can give someone context they didn't have at the time. So what actually happened after Sharmini walked out of her apartment that morning is still unknown. But one theory investigators have considered starts with the job itself. Retired homicide detective Matt Crone believes the offer of undercover work may have been the way Sharmini was lured away from home. In the version he described to CBC, Sharmini could have been told she was being taken somewhere to watch for drug activity as part of a police operation. She could have been given specific instructions, told to watch certain people or activity and report back, all while believing there was a legitimate reason she needed to be sitting somewhere alone and keeping what she was doing a secret. That raises the possibility that Sharmini willingly went to the East Don Parkland or another secluded area because she believed that that's where she was supposed to be there for that job. There's also now another account that came forward in 2019 from a man named Charlie who believes he saw Sharmini sitting on a large rock in the park with Stanley standing several yards away from her. That sighting came forward 20 years later and has never been independently confirmed, so it has to be treated cautiously. But the location he described was the same part of the park where Sharmini's remains were eventually found. There is also the possibility that Sharmini never made it to the park alive and that her body was brought there later. Because so little of her remains were recovered, investigators were never able to actually determine how she died or establish the place where she was found was actually a place she was killed. And despite everything that has come out about Stanley Tippett in the years since, there is still no physical evidence publicly known to place Sharmini with him that day. Tippett has always denied seeing Sharmini on June 12th and has denied any involvement in her death. Sharmini was just 15 years old. She was bright, outgoing, and opinionated, but also incredibly kind. She was hardworking and family-oriented and loved by all, and she deserved to live the life she had ahead of her, and her family was robbed of all that time with her. If you have any information on the murder of Sharmini Anandavel in 1999, please contact the Toronto Homicide Team at 416-808-7400 or at homicide@torontopolice.on.ca. You can also remain anonymous by contacting 416-222-TIPS or via the internet at www.222tips.com. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate this podcast, please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen. On Apple, you can leave written reviews, and I read every single one of them. Case suggestions can be made to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. And be sure to follow me on TikTok and Instagram at simplertimecrimepod to see all bonus material and pictures. If you wish to support the show monetarily, I have a supporters club link in the show notes. My hosting platform is Spreaker by iHeartRadio, and if you download the app and subscribe to my podcast supporters club, you get ad-free episodes while logged into the app or on the website. The link is way at the bottom of the show notes. As always, thank you so much for listening, and tune in for another episode next Monday.